Nom Nom Galaxy is a brutal dystopian depiction of space-age neoliberal capitalism. In this society, the state monopoly on violence has been lifted, and private enterprise has become not only international, but planetary, wielding enormous financial power and raising private armies to execute monetary obstacles. Hyper-powerful company executives spend their time between their glass towers and their beachside villas, while their employees risk their lives in absurdly dangerous environments to produce their products. These locations are simply not hospitable to life. The atmosphere is devoid of oxygen, and every single creature is hostile to the simple astro workers. Here, loss of life is a regular occurrence, if not at the hands of the enraged planets, then at the hands of the rival corporate death squads. These corporations only operate for their own profits, destroying pristine environments by building factories in protected vacation destinations through creative zoning and processing endangered species to the point of extinction. They take advantage of underserved planets plagued by space pirates and conflict zones to pad their own bottom line. All of this damage for the sake of manufacturing products for a hyper-consumer society where the ever-shifting instability of commodity prices determines trends in status items, and the inhabitants of poverty or even pandemic-strict planets are still more concerned with status than food. Wait, what? No, sorry. Nom Nom Galaxy is a cutesy side-scroller game about making soup. You combine ingredients that you forage your farm to discover new recipes. You explore very creatively handcrafted large planets to discover new ingredients, and you expand your factory to make more soup, and get you and your robots closer to sources of ingredients. You hire an army of helper bots to help you automate soup making, and tame the wild ingredients. You discover lost treasure and compete viciously with your corporate rivals for local market share, driving them into unprofitability and sending their executives to the slums of Capel, where they will spend the rest of their pathetic lives avoiding the pedersen immigrants to avoid catching horrific viruses. You drive around the surface, collecting ingredients in vehicles and terraforming the planet to better suit your soup desires, and use your soup sales to fund the soup factory of your dreams. You find rare ingredients and slowly cultivate them into a wealth of farmed ingredients. You slowly slaughter the wildlife and press their bodies into soup using mechanical soup machines. You brutalize extremely endangered and delicious megafauna to use as a supplementary ingredient in tomato soup. You gradually destroy the planet to replace the ugly natural formations with the uniformity of corporate machinery, the familiar clanking of sausage dog soup machines slowly nurturing your thoughts of intergalactic market domination. I imagine that for most people, that little bit was just enough to make their minds on whether or not they're interested in this game. I can say that what it does brilliantly. The art style is oddly perfect for this game, a kind of juxtaposition of the cutesy minimalism and simple surface level concept of making soup, with the whimsical writing and mechanics, but with a somewhat darker tone upon some level of analysis. Then, with a second reflection, the art style does display that second level of analysis. It uses kind of unsaturated colors, and the faceless mass of aliens with their icons and leaders portray the secondary theming of the game very well. For 11 Canadian dollars, this level of quality is already worth it. The potential depth of the gameplay makes it go from just an interesting experience to a genuinely good game. Unfortunately, a large portion of the experience of the game comes from a potential of its gameplay, so it's difficult to discuss it further without spoiling a core part of the game as it is. I think that this game is, in many ways, Factorio light, with a much larger exploration portion blended in. It scratches the same itch, slowly automating tasks that you would have to do yourself earlier on. This automation never gets to the scale of Factorio, not even close, but if you enjoy the gameplay loop of that game, going from manual tasks to automated basics, then to freeing up your own time to focus entirely on expansion, then you'll find a lot to like here. This idea of expansion is more important here than in Factorio. There really aren't any production lines in NNG. You don't ever take any resources and turn it into another intermediary resource, but complexity is added in other ways. Unlike Factorio, the operations here aren't precise, they're not mathematical. There's no way to guarantee where exactly creature nests spawn, exactly how many will spawn when, and exactly where their harvested resources will fall, but you can still automate their production. Plants can be farmed anywhere, they're not planted neatly on tiles, so they will not be harvested by stationary machines. Instead, they're farmed by farmer robots that travel from grown plant to grown plant. These systems casualize the automation gameplay of Factorio, removing the min-max and optimization urge by making it completely impossible, but still leave something to think about as you move towards automating sections of your factory. With that, I'm going to put up the spoiler warning as we moved on to a more detailed analysis. NNG is most fundamentally a base building game about improvisation, a mechanical demonstration of that old military saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy. You are an astro worker from Soup Co., landed on a planet to establish a manufacturing plant for the company amidst a hostile environment. From the moment you crash into the surface, every system in this game pulls you in its direction, forcing you to juggle tasks to stay afloat. These mechanics are all very dependent on the surroundings. I think that Factorio is a great comparison to this game, both because many people are familiar with it, and because it and NNG are really the same game, fundamentally speaking, just taken to different extremes. When starting any Factorio game, the actual map doesn't really matter that much. You have your resources conveniently next to spawn, with a source of water always pretty close. Even as the factory progresses, the location of new resource nodes don't really matter. Every resource that gets automated is more or less renewable, meaning that laying double the track for a train really isn't much more work than laying half as much. The map itself doesn't really cause you to make different choices on how you will produce other resources or how you will approach the game at all. Get a few playthroughs in and you won't even need to consider the map. Build your machines, run out of copper, find the closest copper, add it to the system. You decide what you need according to the needs of your factory. In NNG, from the moment you land, especially if it's your first time on the planet, decisions have to be made according to your surroundings. Most pressingly, you're broke, and none of the planets have an oxygen-rich atmosphere. First order of business is to gather some matter to begin construction, and finding a good spot for your office, while making sure that you don't die while doing it. This is already a pretty interesting dynamic. The presence of oxygen pockets is very different from planet to planet, but it's never enough for you to be comfortable. You'll need sufficient matter to avoid having to make a second trip. Time is a valuable resource in this game after all, while also keeping in mind that you need to stay close to the surface to place your office if you find a suitable location. You need to be considering not only the ingredients around the base that will get you going initially, but how your rocket setup will expand, since they need access to the sky. Then you need to consider how much usable space you have, the presence of farmland and ingredients. Maybe you'll sacrifice some of the other things on this list if you see a creature nest in a good location. Their drops are very valuable, and it very well could be worth giving up some of the other advantages for access to a better ingredient. Then you have to consider how automated your chosen spot can be in relation to all of the previous factors. Finally, there's the issue of defense, since your rival will send death squads to your base. All of these are the considerations that may come up before you've placed anything. Then after you have some infrastructure, your office, some soup machines, a few rockets, you begin having to make decisions on ingredients. Each soup takes 2 ingredients, with a total of 20 ingredients in the game. You can already see the sheer number of possibilities. Perhaps it's a good idea to make the early soups out of more accessible ingredients, to be able to keep up your supply. Or maybe it's worth making some soup out of a single rare ingredient you may have found on your way. You'll need the money for the first attack. Or should you save that until you get another rare ingredient to match it with? Then you have to consider the future by planting a certain percentage of your ingredients in a farm. Or maybe you could risk death and go for an early game rare resource by trying to kill some of the creatures from nests. Or, even riskier, look for the lost treasure underground you were told about at the beginning of construction. And then again, later on in the game, when the factory is larger and maybe you even have a few dozen robots working for you, it becomes time to seriously automate some resources. Do you buckle down and invest into farmers and planters to automate farming? If you didn't plan for this, it will be drastically more difficult to do. Maybe your farmland and soup levels are not completely level. Will you create a new one with all the costs associated with it? Maybe you'll draw a corridor all the way to a distant rare nest and set up a transportation network so that you can just collect drops and send them down the hallway to be automatically processed. If you've selected a good spot and planned well enough, maybe you can use towers or fighter robots to completely automate creature harvesting. Maybe you decide, for one of many reasons, that it isn't worth automating something and forego the investment in more manual labor, an equivalent rush strategy against your opponent. In the end, that's the goal. Defeat your rival corporation on each planet by stealing 100% of that market share. You take market share by delivering soup, and your performance will affect the action of your opponent in terms of sending attackers or changing soup strategies. This is yet another dimension on which you're being pulled. With any decision, you must also consider you and your opponent's position. If you're close to losing market share, you may pick less speculative, immediate action to ship something, even if it's not ideal, even if it makes it more difficult to ship the next one, just to avoid a game over screen. If you feel close to a victory, perhaps you'll avoid the longer term automation project and just do the dirty work yourself to speed towards market domination. The core ideas of the systems in NNG, of speculative decision making and always being just a little bit overwhelmed, to even the kind of dark theming of the world, are closely reflected in the controls themselves. For one, the controls are clunky, imprecise. The Astro Worker is kind of slow and builds a lot of momentum while running. He also jumps with a weird amount of power that makes it difficult to land perfect jumps, and often leads to slow momentum-breaking climbs. His oxygen tank is actually quite small, so every venture outside of the factory that amounts to anything more significant than harvesting your crops can be genuinely dangerous if anything goes wrong, even as you become more and more powerful. Even at your peak of wealth and resources and powers, death comes quickly and suddenly. Fall into the wrong spot or get caught in with a few too many monsters at the wrong time, and you will lose a huge chunk of your wealth. Time it right before quitting time, when drops get reset, and you won't even have a chance to retrieve your items. Failing that, you'll still often have to accept that your items are not retrievable if you lost them somewhere new that you don't know how to get to, or somewhere far from a good source of oxygen. Pick up something heavy like a power crystal, and you'll slow to a crawl, being extremely vulnerable as you attempt to expand your factory. But, as a display of how thoughtful this game's mechanic design is, your abilities as a player grow in the same way that your factory does. You go from being able to carry only a single ingredient to two, you gain a double jump and eventually a jetpack that draws from your oxygen as fuel. The moment you begin to feel comfortable about a single mechanic, some new level of complexity is added that makes it that much better. You get a bigger oxygen tank, and eventually even vehicles and the ability to build teleporters around the map, giving you the ability to seriously expand. You go from jumping with difficulty to taking advantage of the momentum and jump timing to propel yourself across the map. Then you get a double jump and can build momentum to travel even faster, and by the end you're jumping off of cliffs and flying to your destination. But again, you're never comfortable. These movements are still tough to pull off, and a mistake will leave you vulnerable as you land somewhere you didn't intend. The jetpack consumes a large amount of oxygen. Mistakes in its use are often fatal. At any moment, manual labor is tough enough to warrant automation, but easy enough to be an option for any other reason. And then, the idea of improvisation in macro decisions has a micro-mechanical equivalent. Your saw is difficult to control and really imprecise. Fixing sawing mistakes, which happen very quickly, is extremely time-consuming and sometimes even impossible. Getting yourself in a particularly bad spot will force you to make improvisational choices about ladders and struts as you scramble to get back before your oxygen runs out. If you were hoping to carry some resources back, even more choices come up regarding your willingness to sacrifice some of what you're carrying to get back, or stubbornly pressing on. Even the night and day mechanic serves this purpose. At the end of each day, every ingredient or resource on the ground is removed, but your health and oxygen are replenished. It's a double-edged sword. You have to keep track of how many resources you clear, since timing it wrong might cause you to lose all of it, but you may be able to time your trips into oxygenless areas much better. So far it's all been praise, and for good reason. The game is internally consistent between its theming and mechanical systems to a degree that is, while certainly not unprecedented, is still very rare in the medium. Naturally though, there are a few major and minor flaws that I want to take some time to go over. I think that the level of automobility is very intentionally precise. Even after automating something, it has to be maintained. since the improvised nature of the non-tile based system for drops and creatures means that things cannot keep working flawlessly forever. This is good, in my opinion. The game really isn't about automation, it's more so about expansion, really the opposite of Factorio, even though automation is a large part of the game. What isn't as good, in my opinion, is that some resources are straight up non-renewable. There are resources that are farmable, and they tend to be very plentiful as well, and those are fine as they are today. Some are, in a way, semi-renewable. Make sure to keep a single oxygrass and you can keep them growing even if you've exhausted all of the supply on the planet. A better example is the berries, which grow on trees that can only be found naturally. If you break the trees, that source of berries is permanently gone, but as long as the tree lives, the resource is renewable. It keeps growing. It can be annoying to have to reload and replace saves if you mess up with the buzzsaw, which is an all too common occurrence, but it's easy enough, and I think that the increased value of these ingredients makes them a pretty fair mechanic. Then there are completely non-renewable resources. There's only 2 of these, so it's not actually too bad, but I think that it's kind of a waste of development time. These 2 resources are some of the coolest ones, sausage bisons and mossy mammoths, but they spawn in levels in low numbers in the case of the bison, and usually single mammoths only in a few levels. Once you kill these and take their drops, they don't respawn. This is actually a fine mechanic in the normal game mode, where you compete for market share with a clear victory or game over screen. It limits the number of hyper valuable resources, while still allowing you to have access to some of the more interesting recipes. However, I think that both of these resources should have been made renewable in free play mode. The whole point of this free play mode is to remove the limitations of the base game and allow you to take the expansion part of the gameplay to the extreme, and having hard limits on resources is quite antithetical to that. Perhaps mammoths spawn out of a large cave that take up a lot of non-usable space, and only appear very rarely, forcing you to check the cave every day in the hope of acquiring it. Maybe the bison don't ever respawn but can be bred in some kind of breeding chamber. Maybe each pair of bison produces another every 2 days or something. Both of these suggestions are meant to seriously limit the amount of these rare resources that can be used. And frankly, neither of them are incredible, but they do successfully keep the coolest ingredients around indefinitely in free play mode. Of course, matter is also limited by what is on the planet already, as are power crystals, but both of these resources are so plentiful that I don't think that any factory short of a mechanical planet will consume all of these resources in a planet anyway. Meanwhile, it's extremely easy to use up a dozen bison, a single mammoth, and not have access to the coolest ingredients in gameplay that will take up more game time for many players. On that note, the campaign mode should be longer. Not in terms of planets, there are absolutely enough of those, and not even in terms of map size, as I'm going to discuss in a moment. Even if you do run out of those, there's a PNG-based system of editing planets that lets you make your own. The issue really is planet length. The amount of time you spend on each planet is too short. If the speed of gaining market share was 2/3 the speed it currently is, or perhaps there existed some mechanic that caused bigger shifts in market share to make sure that it's more unstable, then the player could spend more time at each location. As it stands, by the time you've got some basic automation and money and are ready to start those longer-term, large-scale projects, the game ends. If each match lasted around 50% longer, then there would be time to complete one such project and see it pay off just near the end of your playtime at a planet as it starts producing a ton of soup. To give you a point of reference, here's how my game time went on Shisango, a planet with a lot of meteoric activity, as you can see. I started around here and worked my way down towards this location, where I set up my factory. I set up a small farm and a dozen or so soup machines to be left here, and automated transportation from a creature nest. Then I built a large vertical hallway from here to the water surface so that I could use the pineapple fish there to make pineapple soups and send them up to my rockets. Then I won. That was it. My whole experience of this level was this little sliver of the map. I actually think that this level was great. My time with this planet was very rich, in my opinion. And the purpose of the sheer size of this level is to not only allow you to enjoy the level multiple times, but also to give you the scale required for free play mode. But imagine if I had had time to expand just a little bit into the surface here and automated a farm of oxygrass. All of a sudden, I'm not a small manual factory with a long semi-automated pineapple farm, but instead an automated factory with multiple input of multiple rare farmable ingredients, and my job would have been collecting rarer materials to combine with the automated ones. Winning at this point would still leave most of the map untouched, leaving me tons of replayability, but certainly would have made this level even more memorable. It's also worth noting that many levels have special gimmicks to play around with. On this planet, traffic authorities have cracked down on illegal shipping lanes, delegating you to use only provided rockets at given spots. This one was recently embroiled in a civil war, and you can find these explosive robots that are littered around the level. This one here, easily one of my favorites, is in a somewhat abandoned and seldom visited part of the galaxy, and there are rumors of a large UFO occasionally appearing. Sure enough, halfway through your game, a little bit more time on each of these planets would allow you to seriously run up against these challenges, while it is possible now to just race to the end manually and win before anything interesting really happens. Another problem is how restrictive terraforming is. As I discussed before, the buzzsaw is very inaccurate and often leads to mistakes, which usually lead to exasperated sighs and abandoned projects or a save reload. The only way to correct mistakes is by moving other blocks manually, one by one, and placing them down in a very clunky way. It's too easy to accidentally collapse a vital section of the planet and mess up every plan that you've made. If there is any large addition this game needs, it's a new building tab, maybe called Environment, that allows you to use matter to place down dirt and water. While we're on the topic of the inventory, the empty soup machine and soup rocket really should be here in infrastructure, letting you quickly find them in the inventory and avoid scrubbing through a set of potentially 400 different soup machines. There's a few more small issues. There should be some kind of warning before large sections of dirt collapse. Oxygen pockets are a little bit too scarce in some parts of the map. The final level really should give you a sizable upgrade for free play mode. Maybe you can now carry 3 ingredients instead of 2. And the game is missing some kind of procedural generation. Multiplayer is a little bit too much of an advantage. The balance of the game gets shifted too much when there are 2 pairs of hands running around. But what is here is extremely polished and dialed in. The core systems here are incredible. When combined with the game's frankly gorgeous art style and aesthetic, plus the brilliant flavor text giving you context to everything, this game is a ton of fun. Nom Nom Galaxy is not really a game you can put 200 hours into, but it certainly is a game that will consume you for 2 weeks and 40 hours of your time and leave you returning to it every once in a while just to experience the casual but thoughtful game design again.